What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review Quentin Tarantino's new novel, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. If you're considering picking it up, I'll avoid all spoilers at first, unless I'm discussing material that's common knowledge from the movie. This is the first time I've read a book by a filmmaker where they've novelized their own work after making the movie. I'm not sure anyone else has ever done it, to be honest. So I won't say the book is based on his 2019 movie of the same name, but more like an extension or amplification of that film, providing a ton of new material for all the major characters. And that was to be expected. What I did not expect was just how many major scenes from the movie would either not be included at all or severely truncated, making the story of the book quite a different storytelling experience. Now, there's nothing about this book that contradicts the movie, but the story ends in quite a different place, and we learn so much more about Rick and Cliff's lives before and after the events seen in the movie. Also, I should add that I'm a big fan of the movie. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was my favorite movie of 2019, and I'll include a link to my original review in the notes below. I think the movie has some of Tarantino's best work ever, like the scene where all the neon lights around town are turning on, all while we hear the tune Out of Time by the Rolling Stones. As far as I was concerned, 2019 was one of the best years for movies in the 21st century, a year which gave us movies by Terrence Malick, Martin Scorsese, the Safdie brothers, and so many more. And that year now, it seems like a very distant memory in comparison to 2020 and what we've seen so far in 2021. So I was overjoyed to step back into this world. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is one of the best movies Tarantino's ever made in his now 30-year career. But in the absence of his great soundtracks and amazing performers he likes to work with, I was really curious to see what Tarantino could pull off as a storyteller with just his voice as an author. Having now read the book, I don't think he's in any way, shape, or form going to be the next Elmore Leonard or any other author Tarantino might admire. That said, if he writes more books, I'll definitely be reading them. So long story short, I ended up enjoying the book quite a bit. It's a quick read, it's very light, has tons of laugh out loud moments. It's also considerably rougher in tone than the movie, but I ripped through the book in about 2 days' time, and I'll soon be giving it a place of honor on my bookshelf. I like to rearrange my shelf over time, slowly giving space to the stuff that I've enjoyed recently. Plus, Tarantino insisted that his publisher launch the book with this tiny little paperback, which is actually a format that I much prefer reading, because I can read it one-handed and I can read it in any position, and I think it's going to easily fit right above my Stephen King book, something I think Tarantino will appreciate. But getting back to the novel, you can't really review it like a regular book. It feels much more like a companion piece or supplementary work than a standalone novel, almost like Tarantino is sitting you down and explaining all the material that wouldn't fit into the movie's running time. And I definitely would not recommend anyone start with the book. This book is for folks who already love the movie passionately and want to know more about the backstory of characters like Brandy and how she became such a badass dog, or what World War II was like for Cliff Booth and just how many people he killed during and after his wartime experiences. Or for Western buffs, Tarantino gives us several chapters all about the backstory of the show Lancer, a show that we really only got a brief glimpse of in the movie. And as many Tarantino fans know, part of his preparation for his movies is knowing the past, present, and future of all of his characters, even if only a small part of all that prep is going to make the final cut. His movies basically give us a window into a much larger imaginary world that typically exists only inside his head. But with this book, we're allowed total immersion into this world. But as much as I enjoyed getting more dramatic scenes between Rick and Cliff, or the new material from Lancer, which is written just like a Western novel, I have to say that my favorite sections by far were those where Tarantino had the freedom to just go nuts with these lengthy rants about film and television history. Now, he's repeated a lot of this material in shows like the Pure Cinema podcast, which is associated with the New Beverly Theater, which Tarantino owns. But I love listening to Tarantino talk about his favorite genre films from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And speaking of the New Bev, I used to go there all the time when I lived in LA, and it pops up a few times in this book. And as something of a film history nut myself, I had a blast watching the way that Tarantino was able to weave fact and fiction together as he writes about the evolution of the Western genre from the late 50s through the early 70s, in particular which filmmakers and actors Rick Dalton has worked with, directors like William Whitney, a largely forgotten filmmaker these days on whose behalf Tarantino is always banging the drum. And in the movie, we really only get a small taste of these details, like when we see a giant poster for Sergio Corbucci's The Mercenary in the lobby at the Bruin. But with this book, Tarantino is able to rant for page after page after page about how the culture changed in the 60s, making Eisenhower-era leading men like Rick Dalton seem out of step with the late 60s, when a lot of younger, more androgynous kind of hippie cowboys like Dennis Hopper started to emerge and gain popularity. And some might argue that this mixing of fact and fiction is irresponsible, but any novel that might be considered historical fiction is going to take a lot of liberties. My hope is that both the movie and the book will excite more folks to take an interest in movie history, because there are a handful of directors out there whose love of film history has been incredibly inspiring to me in my own life. Directors like Martin Scorsese, Francois Truffaut, and Peter Bogdanovich. And I've watched many of Tarantino's recommendations over the years, and I never get tired of hunting down the obscure cult classics that helped Tarantino form his overall style and aesthetic. And if you want to hear about my favorite examples, check out my video where I count down my top 10 favorite movies recommended by Tarantino, and I'll include a link to that in the video notes below. The biggest shocker for me by far was just how sexual this book can be. Tarantino's never really been that interested in sex in his movies, apart from his obsession with women's feet. And part of that comes from his time working as an usher in a porn theater, and he admits that porn got to be pretty boring to him. But almost like water building up behind a dam for decades, this book unleashes so much provocative sexual content that completely, totally caught me off guard. Scenes like the one where Cliff picks up Pussycat are straight up XXX in this book. And speaking of Pussycat, so much of this book is about how Charles Manson's underage followers were constantly screwing and spreading STDs to Hollywood slimeballs. That is, at least when the girls weren't dumpster diving and looking for food. But all of Charles Manson's family aside, the emergence of dirty movies and high-class European erotica is also a huge part of this book, leading to scenes like the one where Cliff takes a girl to see I Am Curious Yellow, which opens the door to yet another film history rant by Tarantino. And maybe getting married and becoming a father has had an impact on this side of Tarantino as well, but for me it was very refreshing seeing an aging filmmaker at this point explore new terrain that he does not explore in his movies. And if he sticks to his plan of making only one more movie, who knows, maybe he'll do something crazy like make a giant erotic epic like Caligula. So when it comes to my critiques, they're mild. I didn't expect to come away from this book thinking that Tarantino's the next Fitzgerald or Faulkner or Hemingway, and I think having realistic expectations is important when reading a first-time author, even one who has written as many screenplays as Tarantino. Writing books and scripts are two different things. But if I had to nail down one big complaint about the book, is that this book has absolutely zero sense of urgency or forward thrust and momentum, and almost no ending at all. But when I picked up this novel, I didn't really expect that. What I expected and wanted was to read dozens, if not hundreds of pages about the inside baseball of Hollywood, which I got in abundance. Tarantino not only dedicated the book to his wife and kid, but also to a lot of the old-timers like Kurt Russell and Michael Parks, who shared with him so many of the stories that informed and inspired the characters of Rick and Cliff. But the book doesn't really feel like a novel. What it really feels like is just this giant screenplay where Tarantino is making a pitch for an epic show that's much longer than the movie that we saw. A quick side note, to promote this book, Tarantino has been hitting the talk show and podcast circuit as of late, and as always, his comments generate a lot of interest and in some cases, serious controversy. And there are some people out there who seriously hate this guy, including some folks whose opinions I respect, but I have nothing but love for his work, even if I'm willing to acknowledge that his personal style frequently rubs folks the wrong way. I strongly recommend people hunt down his 3-hour interview with Joe Rogan, where he had some really interesting insights about the self-fulfilling prophecy of worrying about what they will allow you to make, even in 2021, a time that I find to be quite censorious. But no one ever gave Tarantino permission to write Reservoir Dogs, and he was happy to live with the outrage of folks who kept walking out of that movie during the torture sequence. And he was told that if he removed that sequence, that the movie would become much more commercial, but he stuck to his guns, he kept it in there. But speaking of controversy, I also thought it was funny seeing folks' reactions to Tarantino's appearance on Bill Maher when Tarantino said that Hollywood today values ideology over entertainment. But that's hardly controversial. Take a look at any of the public statements made by companies like Amazon about their approach to making film and television. They place their ideology front and center, and that's totally their choice. Once again, Tarantino's just calling attention to what is staring all of us in the face. And to be clear, I have absolutely no problem with filmmakers and studios getting as political as they like, as long as they don't have a problem with me if I choose to take a pass on buying a ticket. What I think's been forgotten in 2021 is how even during the Great Depression and World War II, Hollywood continued to make Technicolor musicals and westerns. Pure raw entertainment and escapism always has a role to play no matter what's going on in the world. So when Tarantino says that right now ideology is more important to Hollywood than art and entertainment, I totally agree. But this video is starting to turn into its own novel, but I do want to give a shout out to a few specifics from the book. So my spoiler-free section is now officially at an end. Last warning, 3, 2, 1, bail out now if you don't want anything spoiled. But the biggest ingredient that I want to mention is the expanded version of Cliff Booth. As much as I already love Brad Pitt's performance, I really got into all the extra material on his character, like the deep dive in all of his confirmed kills during World War II. And also we get so much great stuff about the side of him that's a huge film buff, in particular the films of Akira Kurosawa, and how his time spent fighting the Japanese in the Philippines only enhances his appreciation of the movies. But Cliff has so many violent and/or hysterical scenes, like when he describes to Rick that if he wants the experience of killing someone with a knife, he needs to grab a writhing pig and stab it to death with his own hands. The craziest material, though, is about the 3 times where Cliff committed murder after the war, her and got away with it. Once to take Brandy away from someone who was going to kill her in a dogfight, another when he shot 2 mafia guys trying to intimidate him, and the most notorious, we finally get the true story of when he shot his wife with a harpoon gun. Overall, Cliff is just a rougher, nastier, more dangerous character in the book, which gives us so many additional insights to his battle with Bruce Lee. Cliff has fought countless people to the death with his bare hands, and for me, that changes their friendly contest quite a bit and makes it much less controversial in my eyes. The little girl Trudy also has a lot more material in this book, and deservedly so. That character is fantastic. I have a little trouble believing that she's only 8, given the dialogue that Tarantino supplies to her, but she has so many fantastic scenes where she makes Rick uncomfortable, talking about how his character Caleb is going to ride off with her and make her his child bride. But they end up forming this real rapport, running lines on the phone at night, which is how the book ends. But what was cool is when Tarantino gives us a glimpse of her future, we learn down the road that she eventually got nominated for 3 Oscars, the last of which was for a performance in 1999, working for Tarantino on a project based on a John Sayles script. This is truly Quentin Tarantino's fairy tale about Hollywood, where, like with any good book, it turns into a confession on the part of the author. But more than anything, it's just a love song to the movie biz and all the weird, strange landmarks and experiences to be had in that strange town called Hollywood. Pink's, El Coyote, the New Bev, these are all key parts of the Hollywood experience that I had when I got my first internship out there in the summer of 1997. Now, I don't miss LA, but this novel definitely reminded me of some of my favorite experiences. It's also a reminder of what a brutal, savage place LA can be as well. The hippies in this book, they're just terrifying. For people with a taste for the rough stuff, the book is a much rougher experience than the movie. The movie honestly feels much more polished and much more mainstream by comparison. In any event, I'm starting to ramble, and I'm also starting to run out of energy, and my voice is getting hoarse. So, long story short, I recommend the book. I even like smelling the pages like a crackhead. I don't know why I always do that with my paperbacks, but smelling the pages of books is part of the overall just tactile experience of holding a book in your hands. But I hope you enjoyed my reaction and review to the book. If so, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. And if you want to talk more about Tarantino or the book or whatever, you can always find me on Twitter @GeekinOut. But I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.